Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. I get to add my welcome to this and my enthusiasm about this entire field as we begin this, might I even say, historic conference. I really want to thank Nick. We're going to be thanking him throughout the entire time, who has been absolutely heroic in pulling this together as the executive director. And although David and I get the privilege of welcoming you, there is a steering committee, which was somewhat arbitrary. It was the first groups that we knew of who were actually not just talking about sequencing, but were doing it or about to do it, actually budgeted to do it in the world. And there are many others. People are going to be rotating on and off this steering committee. Everyone here who wants to is going to have a chance to lead in this organization. But I do want to thank this initial group for getting this started. We've together created this entire consortium and this entire conference out of thin air. Nothing was there before. So how cool is that to start something absolutely new? I also want to say, vis-a-vis my kind introduction from Nick, is I'm often the one who gets to speak about BabySeq, our study you'll hear about more this afternoon. But I have shared the leadership of that in BabySeq 1 with Alan Beggs and in BabySeq 2 with Ingrid Holm, and Ingrid is here today and will be talking to you about that. So the International Consortium on Newborn Sequencing is here today. You are part of it. If you haven't actually signed up as an individual or an organization, please actually sign up and join what we have as a monthly call to just talk about things in this field. If it gets too big, we'll break it up, we'll restructure it, but we want you to actually join and we want you to be part of this group. If you weren't here last year, you may know that we had a wonderful opening conference last year at the Museum of Science, and as you'll hear at the very end of this conference, there will be one next year, already planning, and I'll leave the reveal to Nick as to where that will be. Why are we doing this? Because we need to talk to each other, because there are such cool issues in terms of protocols, consents, outcomes, gene lists, variant architecture, regulatory challenges, and best practices that we can learn from each other and thereby accelerate the field. Just already, in a very simplistic way, you're going to hear about later in this conference about efforts that we've already made to create hard drive areas where people can share their protocols, where people can share their gene lists, where they can share their consent forms. Before this, there was no place, there was no centralized place for this. Gene lists in particular are sort of really fun to compare. This isn't every study, but look how different they are. The Australian group is going to be doing a much more refined view of this later on that you're going to hear about. But how interesting is it that we've all basically taken some of the same criteria, right? The treatability, penetrance, what can be detected with a genome sequence, and we're coming up with such different gene lists. That's not necessarily bad. We represent different regions, different values, but we can certainly learn from each other. Now, in my remaining 5 minutes up here, I just want to say a few words about this whole concept of newborn sequencing. Look, it's been discussed for well over 30 years. I think there's a quote that I was told about back from the 1980s from one of my heroes, Wally Gilbert, but here are a few that I found going back 30 years about anticipating the day when newborns could have their DNA sequenced and they could have this blueprint for human health that they could play off of for the rest of their lives. And this particularly leads us into a series of questions about where this is going to land in the spectrum between public health, medical care, and what you might consider to be everyday life. So, for example, we are in England, so let's remember from Romeo and Juliet, what's in a name. And just to set the tone for the discussions, let me contrast a few words that we are already using together and see if they resonate with you the way they do with me. So if you'll listen carefully, you'll notice that some people are describing newborn sequencing as an extension of newborn screening. They're literally using the word screening plus or expanded screening, but they're using that nomenclature. And they're tying, through that use of words, they're tying it to the public health effort that we know today as newborn screening. Other people are really separating this off, and they're using a different abbreviation, a different word. They're making it, they're carefully deciding to use newborn sequencing as opposed to newborn screening. Now, why are they doing that, and what does that mean, if anything? Well, this public health orientation, I would argue, implies a certain urgency and a certain amount of reduced choice. Remember, we bring public health intervention to things like seatbelts, helmet laws, vaccinations, fluorination in the water. So we bring things to the entire population. Whereas in medical care, and even more so in sort of consumer health, we have choice. We have a kind of joint decision-making with a clinician. Where does newborn sequencing belong in this spectrum? Or does it belong in several places, depending on how you roll it out? Is this something to be really focused on the first year, first 5 years of life? Or is this something to be a foundation for genome-guided care throughout the entire lifetime? And so as you read these papers, it makes a difference whether you describe this as a form of expanded newborn screening or as something completely different. What's in a name? You'll hear a lot of people talking about diagnosis when they find an asymptomatic child with a pathogenic variant. I would argue to be very careful and maybe not use that term at all. I would argue for the term risk stratification, because a healthy child who carries a pathogenic variant is not a patient, at least not yet. What they carry is a risk of developing a condition. And both for societal reasons, but more importantly for medical reasons, we may not want to call that a diagnosis. We may not even want to muddy the water by calling it a molecular diagnosis. Because what I would argue is we are starting on a Bayesian journey at that point, where we have a prior probability that is elevated, and then we continue with orthogonal testing to move that probability higher or lower. Someone who has a pathogenic variant for cardiomyopathy, you look at their echocardiogram, if the rate of thickening of that heart wall is increasing, you've moved that probability even higher. If it's not, you can move that probability lower. So as we think about these words, think about this in terms of prior probabilities. Identification of individuals who are at risk affords an opportunity, not a diagnosis, an opportunity for early recognition of preclinical, presymptomatic phenotypes. And with that recognition, of course, the opportunity to alert families and potentially the opportunity to initiate treatments. What about actionable and non-actionable, or if you like better, treatment and non-treatable? Boy, isn't there a world of variation in what we each mean by that? And I like this diagram from Katrina Goddard, which reminds us that it makes a difference if you're talking about the person, the family, or the entire society. And it also makes a difference if you're talking about some strictly medical treatment as what you define as actionability, which you could argue is very chauvinistic of us medical folks, or you're talking about the things that are important to families in terms of their jobs, in terms of insurance, in terms of lifestyle. And families tell us over and over that they're very interested in all of these things. So in terms of when you hear actionable and non-actionable throughout these 2 days, think about whether we're talking, again, about that public health orientation, or we're talking about a medical practice orientation, or we're talking about what's long been called personal utility. And finally, or almost finally, what's in a name in terms of penetrant and non-penetrant? I think we in clinical genetics have gotten into the habit of thinking about penetrance in terms of the slice of time in which we see a patient or a family in front of us in clinic. Here's a variant, here's a human being. If they have features of the disease, it's penetrant. If they don't have features of the disease, it's not. But of course, if we're thinking about screening with genomics, we are talking about the potential for manifestation of that disease over decades or multiple decades. And so with the concept of penetrance, we have to now expand our time frame over a much longer period of time and think in terms of orthogonal testing to detect the earliest, maybe even molecular signs of that disease rather than the full-blown clinical syndrome. Think in terms of family engagement and cascade testing. Think in terms of what does it mean over time to revisit that genome and reinterpret it in light of scientific progress and in light of new therapeutic developments. We cannot think of the genome any longer as a static entity. It must be interactive with the family. And finally, yes, sharing and privacy. Don't you love these pictures? Sharing and privacy. Boy, are these, in some ways, we'll find technological ways to share while preserving privacy, of course, but that's a challenge. It's a challenge in people's minds because in our work, privacy and discrimination is the #1 concern that people cite for not cooperating. And it's the #1 important scientific value, sharing in terms of large genomic data sets and improving our science. So whether we're talking about sharing among family members, clinicians, with the medical record, sharing with each other for scientific benefit, sharing with industry for the development of therapies, wow, we've really got to address this head on and in ways that preserve our integrity as scientists and the trustworthiness that we create in the world with the families that we hope to serve. So this is your forum. It's a forum for real-time sharing. It's a forum for collaboration and collegial interaction. Everyone is invited. It's so good to see so many friends and colleagues and future friends and colleagues here today. Please sign up, get your friends to sign up, make your voices heard, argue collaboratively and collegially, fight collaboratively and collegially. But let's have fun with this. We are on the vanguard of a whole new arena of science and society. Let's contribute to something really important, and let's have fun while doing it. Thank you so much for coming today.
Is really important to us. So the background, if you think about newborn screening, we are all used to this notion that, all right, Guthrie put together the Guthrie card in 1961, and since that time that newborn screening was developed in the US, there's a large panel that's often screened for. It's at least 35 conditions that are on the RUSP. And so newborn screening has really turned out to be one of the great, if you will, international success stories. One of the things that really helped us with that international success story was tandem mass spec. It allowed us to increase the number of conditions that we screened for at lower cost and to do it very rapidly. But one of the challenges with the current technology is that to add a condition to the list, you really want a lot of samples to try out a particular analyte. And so typically it's quite a number of years to go through that process of adding an analyte and then going through the process of adding it to the routine screening panels. So why are we meeting? So I thought it would be fun to have a case. This was a 2-year-old from Kuwait whose parents were first cousins. He developed a mild fever, and then all of a sudden he was having difficulty speaking. He developed involuntary movements, and obviously he was rushed to the hospital. An MRI scan showed what you see here, which are these abnormalities, those white areas in the basal ganglia. Those are abnormal. Those are dying cells. And so a rapid exome was performed on the child, and they found this particular variant, this threonine variant that you see up here. So we knew that this child, or the folks taking care of the child, had biotin thiamine responsive basal ganglier disease, right? So that's a very serious disease. It's quite rare. But we do know that this variant has been seen and reported repeatedly in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So there was a great deal of confidence in the diagnosis. So what's the treatment? Well, see if we can find it here. I brought the treatment with me. Biotin. And the other treatment, thiamine, right? I went down to the health food store. It cost me 12 pounds to buy both of these. So they treated these children, and the older child, the child who had symptoms, the symptoms actually resolved a good deal, and yet there was some residual speech and motor problems which were really probably permanent. They then naturally checked the younger asymptomatic child, who it turned out had the exact same variants. They started that child on medication, and that child never developed symptoms again. And so this is a great success story, right? You had a child with a condition, they were rushed to a hospital, they got an exome, and we treated the child. So I guess the question is, can we do better? So is newborn screening possible in this situation? So in terms of the typical things we look for newborn screening, we'd want to know, well, is it common enough in the population to bother with? Well, I think that could be said to be true in Kuwait. Is there a treatment which could make sense? The answer is yes. Is there enough time to get that treatment done before the patients become symptomatic? Well, the answer to that is yes. But there are, unfortunately, some serious limitations to what we know. We really don't know the extent of the broad range of the disease, what happens to children over time. There's not a good non-DNA test for this. And so this is kind of the challenge. This is kind of what we're all going to be talking a lot about in the next few days is, can this kind of process, the process we're going to talk about, can that make sense for children like this and rare diseases like this? So treatable genetic conditions, there's a website that I worked on, Richard Scott worked on, and this, if you go to this website, you'll find that there's more than 700 treatable conditions. And if you look at OMIM, which is Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man, it is a catalog of genetic conditions. There's about 4,800 disorders where the gene and the disease have been connected. And so for those 4,800 genes, it turns out that about 15% of them have a specific treatment. So there are quite a number of treatable disorders that we could potentially approach with a newborn kind of process. Also, these conditions are reasonably common. For a number of the disorders, for 400 of those disorders, we have an estimate of the disease frequency. And so if you add them all up, you find that about 1 in 175 children who are born have one of these treatable conditions. And so if you just work out the numbers for the United States, where there's, I guess, about 3 million births, you get about 50 or more than 50 children a day born with a treatable condition. So this is really part of the challenge of where we want to think about heading. Well, you can't do this if it costs a lot of money. At least one company has now announced, actually last year, that for $200 you can get that DNA sequence. That doesn't obviously include the analysis, but we know that the cost is dropping. So we're coming into a time when this might all really be possible. So what are we going to hear about during the conference? We're going to hear from those programs that are starting research programs to examine this. We're going to learn a lot about maybe what's possible, what's not possible. Also, we're going to hear from some of the issues that arise for the governments, for in the US and the UK, around such a prospect. Very importantly, we're going to hear from folks in industry, folks who are really providing the tools to really make all of this possible. And so we're going to hear from them because they are incredibly important partners if this is going to succeed around the world. There are critical topics about implementation, about ethics, and a group that we really must keep our eye on at all times, which are really the patients and the patients' families. So just a few things to keep in mind. You can read quickly this list. I will say that Robert is going to go into this in a bit more detail. So I don't want anyone to think that we have the answers, but we can get to a place where we can help children. And we do need to work our way through this list. So what would I like everybody to do at this conference? One is to soak in the science and the medicine. I really would ask everybody to find somebody at the conference you've never met, and please go up and say hello to somebody you don't know at all. This is really a worldwide team. You're all on the team. The people who are on the call, who are watching this remotely, you're on the team. Everybody should get to know the members of the team. And the last thing I will say is, please remember that the infants in our study are not research subjects. They are a family's precious child. Thank you.